What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to a new episode of the Bleav in Bucs podcast. My name is Jonathan Shields, and it's everyone's favorite time of the offseason. It's time to predict the Bucs' way too early record for the 2026 season. The Bucs will have their optional OTAs coming up here, or optional minicamp, mandatory minicamp, OTAs, all that fun stuff coming up in the next few weeks before training camp. So obviously, we'll have all that coverage as well. But before all that happens, as some other teams' voluntary mini camps and all that stuff has already taken place, the Bucs one will start next week. Before we get into that, it's time to do what we did this last year. In May, we kind of go through, and with what we know now, before training camp, before a game has even been played, before any kind of snaps of the 2026 season, we're going to try to predict the Bucs record. And the Bucs, like we talked about, the Bucs have a really interesting schedule compared to the other teams in their division, but honestly, than any other teams in the NFL. The Bucs don't have back-to-back road games. They have 3 straight home games at one point, no back-to-back road games. And I really think their schedule sets up favorably, specifically for some of the really tough games. So when you look at the schedule, you think, okay, what are the toughest games? At Dallas, the Bucs haven't really played well there, and without Tom Brady, for being completely honest. Green Bay is a tough game. At Chicago, Sunday Night Football is a tough game. Really, at all the NFC North. At Detroit, the Bucs won there 2 years ago, didn't win there last year. And at Baltimore would kind of be the tough road games. And then you look at what would be the tough home games. The Chargers made the playoffs last year. I'd consider them to improve. And then the Rams are Super Bowl favorites right now. Those would be kind of the tough ones that we look at. And then for each one of those games, except for the Dallas one, I think the Bucs have some sort of thing going into their favor outside of Dallas and Chicago. So for the Rams, we talked about this last week. The Bucs play the Rams in Week 17. That's the second to last week of the season. Now, we don't know where the Bucs are going to be at that point, but the Rams play the Seahawks in Week 16 and Week 18. So the Bucs get them in a really advantageous scheduling point that they have to travel cross country and play the Bucs, and then go back cross country and play the Seahawks. So I think the Bucs catch them at a good time there. When the Bucs play at Detroit, the Bucs play at Detroit coming off their bye week. When you look at who the Lions play coming off that, the Lions play in New England. The Lions, this is their Germany game. So the Lions, when the Bucs get a bye, the Lions will be in Europe playing against the Patriots. Not to mention the Lions have a Week 6 bye. So not that they have to play Green Bay, Minnesota, Miami in Germany against New England, then home against the Bucs. So that's what the Bucs sitting at home coming off a bye. That is an incredibly advantageous scheduling spot for the Bucs to go beat the Lions. So those are the two that kind of stick out to me the most right away. Anytime the Bucs get a home game in the first month of the season, I consider it an advantage for them, just because it is going to be so unbelievably hot. So when Cleveland comes to town in Week 2, when Minnesota comes, even though it's a 4 or 5 game in Week 3, and then especially when Green Bay comes in Week 4. So Green Bay is the one that everyone kind of has circled. And the Bucs actually kind of get a little bit of a tough break there, because the Packers get a few extra days because they play the Falcons on Thursday Night Football that week before. Now, let's go where I think the Bucs will have the toughest kind of scheduling spots. Going to Dallas on a Thursday Night Football is a rough spot for the Bucs. That's going to be a tough game for them. And then going to Chicago on Sunday Night Football. Not that Chicago, I know Chicago had all the hype last year, and I like Chicago. They're going to be a good team. And the Bucs kind of get a little bit of a break because they're coming from being at Seattle on Monday Night Football before they come and play the Bucs. So short week and a long trip for the Bears. But just having to play in Chicago in November, it's going to be cold. The week before the bye, we kind of saw how that went last year with the Rams, and obviously did not go in the Bucs' favor. So let's go kind of game by game. So the Bucs going to Cincinnati is incredibly intriguing, because I think that Cincinnati will be better this year. Joe Burrow actually came out and said that this is the most talented team he's been on since he's been in the NFL. Obviously they made a lot of the big trades in the offseason. They get Dexter Lawrence for their first round pick to help bolster their defensive line. And the Bengals have been notoriously bad in the Joe Burrow era in Week 1. Excuse me. I think they won last year in Week 1, but they have like a 2-5 record or something. And the Bucs are notoriously really good in Week 1. So This is a game that the Bucs can 100% win. Just because of those kind of factors, I think if they played this game in Week 5, then the Bengals would win. But the Bucs under Todd Bowles has been notoriously really good in Week 1, so why would I doubt them there? So if I have the Bucs winning Week 1 and Week 2 against Cleveland, I think Cleveland's going to be kind of by far the worst team in football. And then you come home, you play Minnesota in Green Bay after also the Cleveland games at home. So if the Bucs somehow split those two games in this scenario, you're looking at 3-1, and then everyone's going to be talking about the same story. It's like, here go the Bucs again, starting strong and just waiting for the collapse to happen. But I think this team is sneakily really good. People are going to look at Mike Evans leaving, Levante retiring, all that stuff, but I think the team got better as a whole over the offseason. So in some way, I think they're going to go 1-1 against Minnesota and Green Bay to get to 3-2. I think they're going to lose to Dallas in Thursday Night Football to go to. So now we're beat Seattle, beat Cleveland. So 3-1 after the first 4 weeks. 3-2 after Dallas. I think they'll beat Pittsburgh to go to 4-2. I think they'll lose to Carolina at Carolina 4-3. I think they'll beat Atlanta at home 5-3. And I think they'll lose to Chicago on the road. So I think they're sitting 5-4 at the bye week. And if you're sitting 5-4 off the bye week, I think you got to be incredibly thrilled with where you're at. Incredibly thrilled. So the Bucs come off the bye, and just because that scheduling spot for Detroit, I think they beat the Lions because the Lions have to come from Germany. I cannot believe their bye week's not after their Europe game. Instead, they got to come play a rested Bucs team. So with that, I have the Bucs going to 6-4. I have them splitting with the Panthers. So however you want to win it, 7-4 after that second Carolina game at home on Monday Night Football. I have the Bucs losing to the Chargers and Baltimore. That puts them right at 7-6. And then now you really get into the heart of the division schedule. So you're 7-6 going into week 15, 16, 17, 18. So what's the Bucs division record going to be? Because I think that they're going to split with Atlanta. I think they're going to split with Carolina. How good is New Orleans this year? I think that's one of the biggest questions kind of out there right now because New Orleans came on really strong at the end of last year. They were a fun team last year, kind of a trendy pick to kind of be better this year. If the Bucs go 2-0 against the Saints, I think they win the division in this kind of mock setup. So we're in week 15 right now. Just to go back and reiterate, I have the Bucs beating Cincinnati and Cleveland 2-0. I have them splitting some capacity with Minnesota and Green Bay 3-1, losing to Dallas 3-2, beating Pittsburgh 4-2, losing to Carolina 4-3, beating Atlanta 5-3, losing to Chicago 5-4. I have them beating Detroit and Carolina to get to 7-4. I have them losing to the Chargers and Baltimore to get to 7-6. So they're sitting at 7-6 in this first New Orleans game. I think they beat New Orleans to get to 8-6. I think they lose to Atlanta. I think they'll split with Atlanta, and all of a sudden you're at 8-7. Now, there's a huge chance this Rams game kind of sets the table for everything. Right now, I lean the Bucs going 9-8, 10-7, 9-8, kind of where they've been. But that's with a lot of toss-ups. That's with them beating Detroit. That's with them beating Cincinnati. And that's with them splitting with both Carolina and Atlanta. So when you look at some of these games of what's going to determine what the Bucs schedule is going to be, it's going to be, okay, what's their record against Cincinnati, Green Bay, Chicago, Detroit, the Chargers, Baltimore, and the Rams? Those are, in my opinion, the toughest teams they play outside of the division. So you have the Rams, the Ravens, the Chargers, the Lions, the Bears, the Packers, and the Bengals. Those are 7 games right there. I'm not saying the other games the Bucs are going to win because every year there's a game the Bucs preseason you look they're not going to win. Last year was Seattle. No one picked them to beat Seattle. And then no one picked them to lose to the Saints at home, right? There's always one on each side. So in those 7 games, can the Bucs get to 4-3? If the Bucs go 4-3 in those 7 games, and then somehow, some way, kind of scratch out a 4-2 in the division, now you're sitting at 8-5. And then, okay, what's your record against Cleveland, Minnesota, Pittsburgh? And then, that kind of rounds out everything. So I think the Bucs have one of the more favorable schedules in terms of how it sets up in the NFL. I know there's a ton of analytics about how, the net rest days and all that stuff. I don't necessarily care about all that stuff. I care about, how it sets up for the Bucs. And I think that, they have a few tough breaks, like going to Dallas on Thursday night. That's a tough break. But the advantages that they have specifically against Detroit and specifically against the Rams, I think are very advantageous for them. So some of their other tougher games before Baltimore plays them. Baltimore has a bye before they play the Bucs. They have one of their later byes in the NFL, so they'll be a little bit more refreshed. And then the other tough game is the Chargers the week before that, and before that, the Chargers will be playing against New England at home. So they have back-to-back home games. So both of them kind of set up well scheduling wise before they play the Bucs, and the fact that the Bucs have to play the Ravens right after a really tough Chargers team, I think that sets up and puts them in a tough spot. And again, these are just teams that I'm higher on. I'm a little bit higher on the Chargers this year. I'm also higher on the Lions this year. I think the Lions have a chance to get back to where they were 2 years ago, be kind of that one seed in the NFC. But that also means that look, going to Europe and not having a bye week after is tough. And the fact that the Bucs have that kind of stretch after where they have a bye and then they play the Lions, that puts them in a really good spot. But as always, it's what's the record going to be against the division. And I think that the Bucs division schedule kind of sits up pretty favorably, considering that they don't have a division game until week 7. And it's in Carolina, and they don't, that's a normal 1:00 game. So last year against Atlanta, they had the 1:00 game in week 1. So if you take that stuff into account, so they play Carolina, Atlanta back to back. One of the sneaky, one of the 3 kind of biggest back-to-back games of the entire season, maybe the biggest back-to-back game of the whole season. And then you go Carolina at home after the Detroit game, part of back-to-back home games with the Chargers afterward. I think the stretch that's going to make or break this season is directly after the bye, when you play Detroit, Carolina, the Chargers, and Baltimore. 3 of those teams were playoff teams last year. Detroit was just as good as any of the teams that made the playoffs last year. So you're looking at 4 huge games right there, probably one of their toughest stretches of the whole year. And then after that, you get New Orleans, Atlanta, the Rams, and the Saints again. A lot of this, if the Bucs are going to make the playoffs, it's how good are the Saints? Again, I've seen a lot of people kind of high on the Saints. I'm not overly high on the Saints. I'm just not a huge Tyler Shuck guy. I understand why people are, but I'm still in wait and see mode for him. But those are the stretches that I'm looking at in terms of how the Bucs are going to do in order to kind of make that stretch. But I don't know if there are many kind of guaranteed wins. You would look at Cleveland in week 2 and be like, yeah, you feel really good about the Bucs in that one. Outside of that, there's no game where I'm like, yeah, the Bucs are 100% going to win that. Last year, before the season started, I was pretty confident that the Bucs were going to beat the Jets in week 3. I was pretty confident the Bucs were going to beat the Saints before the bye. I was pretty confident the Bucs were going to beat the Cardinals in week 13. I was pretty confident, ironically, that the Bucs were going to beat the Dolphins, but the Dolphins ended up beating them. So that's not an entirely foolproof plan. But these are the fun things you do in the offseason way before the season starts. You get to go through your way too early kind of schedule prediction. And, I would have the Bucs at 10-7, 9-8. And a lot of that depends on what we talked about is where do they fall in these certain stretches, right? Where do they fall in that stretch where they go at Carolina, Atlanta, and then Chicago before the bye? How about when they come out of the bye and it's Detroit, Carolina, the Chargers, and Baltimore? Those are kind of the things that I'm looking at as the Bucs kind of get ready to go through. And a lot of this also has to do with the division. The NFC South is not any world breakers or anything, but I do think that they'll be improved. Now, the Falcons I have a ton of questions with because I'm not a Tua guy at all, but their roster is really good. They got the 2 rookie edge rushers last year and another year in. They're the best running back in football, in my opinion. Drake London's one of the more underrated receivers. Talent-wise, I think the Falcons matchup are the team that comes closest talent-wise to the Bucs, not the Panthers, even though they won the division last year. And the Panthers, like we talked about, now they play that first-place schedule where they have to go to Philadelphia, where they have to play Denver at home. And instead of having those games, the Bucs play the Cowboys and the Chargers. I'd rather play the Cowboys and the Chargers than the Eagles in Denver. So, a lot of variables go into this, and obviously, it all starts with what will the Bucs do against the division, and how strong will the division be this year? Last year, a team with a losing record won the division. I don't think that would be the case this year. I think 10 wins will win you that NFC South. And what team is most likely to get there? And I think with the way that the Bucs schedule is set up, I think that they're kind of as ready as anyone to get that. So Before we go, we'll kind of break down the Bucs offseason schedule. So obviously, rookie minicamp is already done, and then OTAs start May 26th through the 28th. So there are those are not mandatory. So mandatory minicamp is June 16th to the 18th, where everyone has to be there. So there are multiple kind of OTA dates. So the first set are May 26th to the 28th, and the Bucs have 9 OTA practices through